Welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today with a little scenario. Picture this. You're at a dinner party, right? Everyone's having a good time, laughing, passing appetizers,
Huh.
and then you decide to drop a single word into the conversation that just instantly sucks all the oxygen out of the room.
I can think of a few, but I have a feeling I know where you're going with this.
The word is sin.
Yeah, that'll do it. That's the ultimate conversation killer.
It really is. It's a word that carries, thousands of years of baggage. It's got guilt, it's got fear, it's got judgment. And, depending on who you ask, the definition just changes completely.
Totally. For some, it's eating too much chocolate cake. For others, it's, deep moral depravity.
And for a lot of modern listeners, it's just an outdated concept used to control people, right?
Right. It's a loaded term. And usually when we encounter a topic like this, the instinct is to just tune out. We think, okay, here comes the sermon, or here comes the list of rules I'm failing to follow.
Exactly. But that is not what we are doing today. We are not here to preach, and we are definitely not here to judge anyone's lifestyle. We're here to do what we always do, take a stack of notes from a very specific source and decode it. We want to see how this particular argument is put together.
And the source for today is a transcript from the My Bible Journal channel, specifically a piece titled, "What is Sin?" And I have to say, even if you are not religious at all, the logical architecture of this argument is fascinating. It frames sin in a way that is just vastly different from the cultural caricature.
It really flipped the script for me. I went in expecting, a lecture on morality, and what I got was a breakdown of psychology, relationships, and cause and effect that feels, well, uncomfortably real.
It moves the definition away from breaking arbitrary rules
Yes.
and frames it as a catastrophic fracture of the very fabric of reality.
So that is our mission. We are going to unpack this Christian worldview that's presented in the text to answer three questions. What is sin, really? Where does it come from inside the human psyche? And this is the heavy part. What are the ultimate consequences?
So let's start with the definition, because if you open the Oxford Dictionary right now, sin is defined as an immoral act. Simple enough.
Right. And if you ask a secular materialist, and the source explicitly brings this perspective up, they might say sin is a fiction.
Yeah, they'd argue that divine law is just a construct invented by religious leaders to keep the masses in line.
Which is a very common and, frankly, a pretty logical perspective if you don't accept the premise of a God. But the source material takes a hard right turn from there. It argues that sin isn't just a behavior or a social construct. It presents sin as the root cause of literally all suffering.
All of it.
Wait, all of it.
All of it. The source argues that if you look at disease, genocide, crime, corruption, even death itself, if you pull the thread on any of those things, you eventually find this thing called sin at the bottom. It's like the mechanic's report on why the world is broken.
That is a massive claim. So to make sense of it, the source gives us a roadmap. We need to go back to the beginning.
The original one.
In Genesis chapter 2, the famous story of Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
You know the story. I know the story. Garden of Eden. Perfect paradise. And God gives them one rule. Eat whatever you want, have a blast, but do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Just one prohibition.
Now, the source brings up a skepticism here that I think is really important to voice. Because on the surface, doesn't God sound like a bit of a tyrant here?
The control freak objection, yeah.
Yeah. Banning knowledge, that sounds like something a dictator does. Don't read that book. Don't look at that website. It feels like he wants to keep humanity stupid and enslaved so he can stay in power. Why wouldn't a loving God want humans to know the difference between good and evil?
It's a completely valid critique. And the source actually uses the term human tyrant to acknowledge how it looks from the outside. But then it offers an analogy that completely reframes the dynamic.
This is the car analogy.
Right. The source asks you, would you let your 3-year-old son drive your car?
No, absolutely not.
Why not? Do you hate your son? Do you want to restrict his freedom?
Of course not. I want him to survive. He's 3. He can't reach the pedals. He has no concept of what happens when 2 tons of metal hit a concrete wall at 60 miles an hour.
Exactly. It's not a question of good or bad. It's a question of capacity. The force argues that God has an eternal perspective. He understands the full weight of moral decisions and their consequences across time. Adam and Eve were, well, they were brand new. They were effectively spiritual toddlers.
So the argument is that God wasn't withholding something good. He was withholding something dangerous. He knew humanity wasn't ready to drive the car of defining good and evil for themselves.
And the source points to human history as the proof. It basically says, look at the wars, look at the Holocaust, look at the corruption. That is essentially humanity insisting on grabbing the steering wheel before we had the capacity to handle it. We crashed the car.
That does change the perspective. It shifts it from God is mean to God is a parent. But the source goes deeper than just the danger aspect. It talks about what that act of eating the fruit actually represented.
And this is the crucial pivot in the definition. The source argues that the original sin wasn't really about the fruit. It wasn't about calories or dietary restrictions. It calls the act a divorce.
A divorce.
Yeah, by ignoring the command, humanity wasn't just breaking a rule. They were cutting the bond with their creator. It was a declaration of independence. It was Adam and Eve saying, we don't trust your perspective. We trust our own. We don't need you to tell us what is right. We will decide for ourselves.
So sin, in this definition, isn't a legal problem. It's a relational problem. It's not a parking ticket. It's serving divorce papers to the source of your existence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that relational lens is what guides the rest of the argument. Because if you fast forward in the Bible, you get a lot more rules.
Oh, man, the rules. The source mentions that Jewish scholars extracted 613 commandments from the Old Testament.
That is a lot of regulation.
I can't even remember my Netflix password half the time, let alone 613 distinct laws. And even if you simplify it to the 10 Commandments, no idols, keep the Sabbath, don't murder, don't commit adultery, it still feels like a checklist of do's and don'ts.
It does seem overwhelming. It feels like a high wire act where one slip means you fall. But the source does this fascinating thing where it compresses all of that complexity down to a single point.
It references Matthew 22.
Right. Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And he doesn't quote the building codes or the dietary restrictions. He boils it all down to two things.
Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.
And the source points out that Jesus says the second is like the first. They are inseparable.
So if the entire law is just love, then we get our operative definition of sin for this deep dive.
Sin is simply not loving.
Okay, I have to pause here. Because love is one of those words that we have completely diluted. I say I love tacos, I say I love the weekend, I say I love my dog. If the definition of sin is just not loving, that sounds really soft. Like, oh, I wasn't super nice today. Oops. It doesn't sound like that catastrophic fracture we were talking about earlier.
You are right to push back on that, and the source actually addresses this head on.
Yeah.
It argues that our cultural definition of love is the problem. We think of love as a feeling or a preference or possessing something that makes us feel good.
Like loving a car or a boyfriend or something.
Right. But the definition here, drawn from how Jesus explains it, is that love is an action verb. It is self-sacrifice.
Laying down your life for your friends, that verse.
Exactly. It means sacrificing your time, your money, your resources, your ego for the best interest of another person. It is fundamentally selfless. It is looking at another person and saying, your needs are more important than my wants.
So let's tie this back. If we go back to Adam and Eve, their sin wasn't that they were hungry. It was that they chose their own desire over the relationship with the God who, as the source puts it, cared for them like a mother.
They chose me over us. They divorced him. And that perfectly tees up the second part of our roadmap, the cause. If sin is a failure to love, what is the mechanism behind that failure? Why is it so hard for us to just be loving?
This is where we get into the psychology of sin. And honestly, this part felt less like theology and more like a therapy session. The source uses a case study to explain the root cause, Satan.
The ultimate antagonist.
The text references passages in Isaiah and Ezekiel that describe Satan's fall, and it points out a specific linguistic pattern in his internal monologue. It's all I will.
I will ascend to heaven. I will set my throne on high. I'll make myself like the Most High.
It's just me.
It's classic narcissism. The source diagnoses the root of sin as pride and self-centeredness. And the logic is actually very sound. If your heart is entirely full of yourself, there's literally no room left to love anyone else.
Right. If I think I'm the main character of the universe, then you and everyone listening, you're just NPCs. You're extras in my movie.
Exactly. And the source used a pretty brutal phrase here. It said that when we are in this state, other people become disposable tissue paper to us. We use them and we toss them.
That is dark. But it makes sense. You can't love someone you view as disposable.
And this is where the source pivots from Satan to us. It forces the reader to look in the mirror with what it calls a time audit.
I tried to do this mentally while I was reading, and I have to admit it was uncomfortable.
It's a very confronting exercise.
The challenge is this. In the last 24 hours, what percentage of your time did you spend serving yourself versus serving God or your neighbor?
And you have to be honest, is it 80-20?
Mm.
90-10?
I mean, be real. For most of us, it's probably 991. We wake up thinking about our schedule, our breakfast, our commute, our stress, our entertainment, but the command is to love your neighbor as yourself. That implies a 50-50 split, doesn't it?
Ideally, yes. The source argues that even if we think we are decent people, we pay our taxes, we don't rob banks, this metric exposes a deep-seated self-centeredness. We are obsessed with ourselves.
We are the stars of our own show.
And according to this text, that self-obsession is the very essence of sin. It's the antithesis of love.
But then the source raises the bar even higher. It talks about the internal standard. It argues that sin isn't just about how you spend your time or what you do with your hands. It's about what's happening inside your head.
Yeah, this is where the Christian worldview becomes incredibly strict. The source cites Jesus again, saying that sin isn't limited to physical actions.
Right. It says if you're angry at someone, that's murder in the heart.
If you look at someone with lust, that is adultery.
If you hold a grudge, that is the sin of unforgiveness.
It's the thought police aspect of it.
But why? Why is the standard so high? I mean, why is being angry at my boss equated to murdering him? That feels like a massive false equivalency.
In a legal court, yes, it is. You don't go to jail for thinking mean thoughts. But remember, we're talking about relationships. The source argues that anger and murder spring from the same root.
The I will.
Exactly. Both stem from the desire to remove someone who is inconveniencing you or hurting your ego. One just deletes them physically, the other deletes them emotionally. Both are a failure to love. Both are a form of that divorce we talked about.
So, by this standard,
everyone is guilty. The source concludes that because the standard is to be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect, and because love requires total selflessness, every single human, except for Jesus, according to the text, has failed. We are all, by this definition, sinners.
That's a heavy verdict. You are a narcissist and you failed. But the source claims this isn't just to make us feel bad or guilt trip us. It says this leads somewhere. It talks about what this condition actually does to a human being. Which brings us to the third part of our roadmap, the consequences.
And to explain the consequences, the source drops a very modern metaphor, drug addiction.
This was the moment it clicked for me. It says sin is like a drug. You start for the illicit pleasure. And let's be real, it feels good to be angry sometimes. It feels good to gossip or to look out for number one. It's a rush.
Initially, yes, there's a high to pride. But the source argues that, like a drug, it creates a dependency. It starts to enslave the user. You become a slave to your own pride, your own lust, your own anger. You lose the ability to choose not to do it.
And eventually, the pleasure vanishes. You aren't doing it because it's fun anymore. You're doing it because you can't stop. And the source says this path leads to death.
But it distinguishes between two types of death. There's bodily death, which we all face, and what it calls eternal death, or the second death.
Okay, we have to unpack this because this is the part where we talk about hell. And the source has a very specific, almost philosophical way of describing it. It's not just a cartoon dungeon with pitchforks and little red devils.
No, and that's a common misconception. The source describes hell as the natural progression of sin. If sin is isolation, if sin is narcissism and cutting yourself off from relationship, then hell is the ultimate, final realization of that state.
It's total isolation.
Outer darkness, as the Bible calls it. The source explains that without love, we break relationships with everyone. We hold grudges, we hate, we push people away. That drives us into isolation. So the weeping and gnashing of teeth mentioned in Scripture, the source interprets that not just as physical pain, but as supreme frustration and anger.
It's like being locked in a room with your own narcissism forever. You're trapped with the worst version of yourself, and there is no one else there to blame.
Precisely. But the imagery gets even more visceral. The source uses this analogy of God being the husband or the energy source.
Going back to that divorce concept again.
Right. If God is the source of life, think of him like the sun to a flower. Then being eternally separated from him doesn't just mean you sit in the dark. It means you wilt.
The phrase that stuck with me, and it's pretty gross, was rot like decaying flesh.
It is disturbing imagery, but it fits the argument. The source argues that the human spirit, cut off from its power source, begins to decay. And it mentions the worm that never dies.
Yeah, talk about nightmare fuel. The source explicitly says this worm is a maggot.
A maggot eating away at the eternally decaying spirit. It's a horrific picture of what happens when that bond of love is completely and finally severed. It's spiritual entropy.
But And this is a crucial distinction the source makes, and I think it's the most important philosophical point in the whole text. It says God isn't the one throwing people into this pit because he's mean.
Right. This is the philosophical flip. The source argues God doesn't send people to hell. People send themselves to hell.
By refusing the relationship.
Exactly. The source frames God as constantly proposing marriage, constantly offering that connection, that lifeline, that source of energy. But if we adamantly refuse, if we insist on our own way, on our own I will, then God eventually respects that choice.
He gives us what we asked for.
He lets us have what we wanted. Life without him, independence.
And life without him is that rotting, isolated existence.
That is the argument. It's the ultimate consequence of the divorce. You get the independence you asked for, along with all its consequences.
So let's recap this journey, because we've traveled from a garden to a pretty dark place. We started with the definition of sin. Not just breaking a rule, it's a broken relationship, a divorce from the Creator.
We move to the complexity of the law, boiling 613 rules down to simply love, which means sin is fundamentally a failure to love.
And we found the root cause, our own pride and self-centeredness, the I will.
We did the time audit and realized that if love is selflessness, we're all pretty deep in the sin category.
And finally, we looked at the consequences. Sin as an addiction that leads to spiritual isolation, decay, and ultimately a reality where we are left entirely alone with ourselves.
It is a stark, bleak picture. It diagnoses the human condition as terminal.
It really paints us into a corner. But the source doesn't end on total despair. It drops a hint at the very end.
It does. It mentions a rescue plan. It circles back to that marriage analogy, saying God wants to rescue us from this state of decay.
Yeah.
But it stops there.
Yeah, it explicitly says, to find out about the rescue plan, watch the next video titled, Why Do We Need Jesus? So the source leaves us on a cliffhanger.
A very strategic cliffhanger. It wants you to feel the weight of the problem, the impossibility of fixing yourself before it offers the solution.
So we can't give you the solution today because our source didn't provide it. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something to take away from this whole forensic analysis.
Yeah, it's something to consider, regardless of where you stand on religion. The source defines sin strictly as a lack of love or self-centeredness.
So the question is, if you stripped away all the religious language, forget the apple, forget the maggots for a second, and just looked at that definition, how does that change the way you view your day?
If every moment of impatience, every grudge, every time you put yourself first is actually a fracture in the world, how different would your last 24 hours look?
And are we all driving a car we aren't quite ready for?
That is the question.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.